Hey, what is up? Welcome to this episode of the Wantrepreneur to Entrepreneur podcast. As always, I'm your host, Brian Lofrumento, and I'll tell you what, I feel like one of those cliches in the world of entrepreneurship and marketing and sales, and heck, even in life, is that we need to be telling stories. But what stories are we supposed to tell? How are we supposed to tell them? What the heck is all this stuff about? Well, I've got an incredibly captivating guest here for you in today's episode. I'm personally very excited about this. His name is Hari Kumar. He is coming all the way from my native Massachusetts, which automatically means that he's tougher than I am because he's been there, I think it's 26 consecutive winters in New England. So Hari is incredible, not just in business-wise, but also this man has lived and been all over the world. So let me tell you about today's guest. Hari's bio kind of has a storyteller's journey. You can think of it being in three parts. Act 1, Hari the engineer, 10 years as an engineer with a master's degree in engineering. Act 2 was Hari the academic, 10 years as a humanities scholar and storyteller with a master's degree in communications. And then Act 3, Hari the sales storytelling coach, 5 years in the tech industry, working at MathWorks, Slack, and Salesforce, which brings him to his current act, which is Act 4, where he makes the jump to entrepreneurship and starts his own consulting company. There were, of course, many twists and turns in this story. We're going to dive into so many of them today, and certainly more will come ahead, but his own roots include India, Yemen, 26 consecutive winters in New England, where he now lives in the Berkshire Mountains of my own Western Massachusetts. I'm not going to say anything else because I'll tell you what, I'm itching to dive straight into my interview today with Hari Kumar. All right, Hari, we've got so much to dive into today, but first of all, welcome to the Wantrepreneur to Entrepreneur podcast.
Brian, thank you so much. I really love the work you do on this podcast. I've loved listening to other entrepreneurs like me on your podcast. So thank you. It's an honor to be on your show.
Thank you so much. That means the world to me. I always love seeing how guests are invested in also not only talking about their own entrepreneurial journey, but learning from other entrepreneurs. I think we can all learn from literally every entrepreneur because we go through so much, which leads me right into you filling in those gaps. I know that the bio is one thing, but hearing it from your words, who is Hari? How did you get here?
Thanks, Brian. Yeah, so, as a storyteller, let me start with a story. The story begins once upon a time. I was a young, naive, and arrogant engineer. This is about 20 years ago when I got my start in engineering. And I was building software tools, mathematical tools. These were very, very complicated engineering tools for other engineers. And I kind of felt like I knew better than my customers. I was like, whenever we'd get bug reports about my tools, I would get, really kind of annoyed. What do they know? Yeah, sure, they're experts in their field, but I'm the tool builder here. Well, I got so annoyed with this that I decided to actually go and train engineers on how to use my tools. And that's when the light bulb moment went off for me, when I realized that for my customers, they didn't care about my tools. They cared about their problem. It was their stories that mattered, not my tools. And in fact, if my tools couldn't help them solve their problems, my tools were useless for them, literally. And so that made me really pivot to listening to them, listening and trying to understand their stories and asking them, so what are you working on? And the weirdest thing happened, Brian, like I'm an engineer. I know fellow engineers. We tend to have this stereotype of, engineers are really hard to, get stories out of. Engineers aren't storytellers. Engineers are all about facts and problems. But you ask engineers, hey, what are you working on? And why is that so important for you? And the surprising thing is even the quietest engineers began to open up and just share story upon story upon story. And I realized that pivoting to making their stories the center of the tool, center of the training, center of how we build products, changed everything. And so that journey started 20 years ago, and I got really bit by the storytelling bug since then, because it wasn't really about telling my story. It's really about listening to the customer story and making the customer story the center of my story.
Yeah, I love how that's where you chose to start this conversation, because that's one thing that I always tell. I've worked with so many different entrepreneurs over the past 15 years. And of course, myself going on my own entrepreneurial journey with multiple businesses. The thing that I've always realized and has really taken the heat off of me when it comes to storytelling is someone once told me, they were like, look, nobody cares about your story for you. They care about your story for them. Everybody just pictures themselves in that story. And it's something that I've used in my marketing, is that I very freely share my story. Hari, as you do as well. You put so much awesome content out into the world. And when I talk about, being the son of an immigrant mom and starting my business as a teenager and going to college and working 10 months in the corporate field, which I definitely didn't like, what I realize is that for me, it's recounting my life's experience. But for the listeners, for anyone I'm talking to, the audience, they're thinking, wait, that's me. Like, I hate my corporate job. Or, oh my gosh, I didn't realize he could relate to me. I'm also the child of an immigrant. Talk to us about the importance of understanding how much of our stories, it's about us telling our experiences versus, hey, the listener is just listening for them. And how can we make our stories open that door, open that window for them to view themselves in?
That's a great insight, Brian, and a great question. I think there's the difference between a story that where people feel like they can just kind of sit back and watch, versus a story that draws people in. And for a story that draws people in, they have to kind of see themselves in the story. And so this is why, for me, like, really understanding who's the main character in the story and making that main character a relatable person, because that's how we build an emotional connection with the main character in the story. So when you share your story, Brian, you're sharing it not just as where Brian is the center of the story, but you're sharing elements of the story that allow somebody else like me to see myself in that story and to be like, oh, this is now a relatable character. The story is relatable. But what that relatability does is it's also an invitation to be in that story and to then experience that world from that main character's perspective. So I think that's a really important part of storytelling for business, is you want to know your customer really well and be able to share and reflect back to the customer a bit of their story. But you also want to bring yourself into that story and to show to your customer that you understand them, but they can also see you as a part of their story.
Yeah, I love that insight. And I love the fact that you actually took what I said once a big step forward, which you said, well, actually, you have to know who the character of this story is. And in my head, I was like, dang, yeah, you're right. It really is about, when I frame these stories, it is about putting my customer inside the stories. So you even just reframe my perception of that right here on the fly. Hari, I want to ask this question, because I know that I have kind of my own tools of doing this, but you are far more strategic and intentional about it. I'm always very much just riffing things. And fortunately, after so many reps, it comes somewhat naturally to me. But you're the expert here. What are those elements of how do we get the character of the story? If that's us, for example, when we're talking about our own hero's journey, how do we make that even more relatable for other people? Because something that I want to call out that you just said is a story that we can sit back and watch. When I watch Harry Potter, for example, I don't picture myself inside of Harry Potter. But what you said, a story that draws you in, how do we make it more relatable?
Yeah, well, first of all, Brian, I want to say, like, I believe we are a storytelling species. And there's a lot of research behind that, but it's also a matter of belief, which means that we all have the ability to tell stories. A lot of us have never been trained on it. So I really believe storytelling isn't just like an innate talent that only some people have. I believe it's a skill that all of us can build and grow. It means practicing. You said it greatly. Like, it's about getting those reps in, and the more practice you have in it, the better you get with it. So that's one thing I really want to put out there, is if anybody's listening to this and thinking, well, I could never be a great storyteller, we already are. If you're a human being, if you're Homo sapiens, you are a storytelling person. But then the real key there is using the power of storytelling for good. And so a key element there of how do you draw somebody in, a large part of it is really thinking through some of the elements of what makes a story compelling. So, of course, you want the main character to be somebody that's relatable, but you also want to know a little bit about what's motivating that main character. So, we tend to resonate really, really well with main characters in the story who have a challenge that we kind of are rooting for them in that challenge. We kind of feel the magnitude of that challenge, and then we get to know a little bit why that challenge matters so much to that main character. So, for example, with Harry Potter, yeah, I'm not a wizard. I don't. I have no idea what it feels like to be able to cast spells, but the underlying premise under Harry Potter is you've got this kid who suddenly gets pulled into a new environment and has to figure out, like, this kid was an orphan. And has a whole set of friends, but also has obstacles, and so suddenly we're kind of rooting for this kid, really, who's growing up, and trying to figure out who his parents were. There's a relatable, motivating tension that even if you're not a wizard, you can kind of associate yourself with that kid. To bring it more practically, your podcast, the Wantrepreneur to Entrepreneur, even in the title of the podcast, you've got the motivating tension there. Your podcast is for people like me who want to become an entrepreneur, right? So that's the main character. The challenge: how do you become an entrepreneur? Now, why is that challenge so important to the person? Well, in every single one of your episodes, you've actually talked to people and asked them that. Why do you want to become an entrepreneur in the first place? And that answer it varies from person to person. For some folks, it is about ensuring stability and security, and wanting to have generational wealth for their children. And for children of immigrants like ourselves, Brian, that's a pretty important motivating tension. For others, it's actually about having some creative freedom. Like you, Brian, I also, I did my time in the corporate environment, but part of my motivation is also, like, I want to be able to create without the constraints of creating for a certain company. So there, even same type of main character, somebody who wants to be an entrepreneur, same type of challenge, how to become an entrepreneur, the motivations can be different. And so really understanding the motivating tension for a main character, those are two of the main elements, I would say. There's more, but I'll stop there. Does that resonate?
Yeah, for sure. Big time it resonates. I feel like it introduces so many other launch points for us to go into. But Hari, as I'm listening to you talk about this, obviously you and I love storytelling. And I would actually argue that a big part of it is, at least for me, Hari, is that immigrant angle and that immigrant aspect of my life, because all growing up, that's what immigrants love to do. They talk about the stories of the old country. So my mom's family comes from the mountains of Albania, where they didn't even have electricity. There's so many stories that come with that. Every immigrant also has the biggest story of all, which is coming to the United States. Like, stories are just everywhere when it comes to any immigrant's journey to the US, which leads me to the flip side, Hari, which is, what about all those times in our lives and all those people out there, and especially all those entrepreneurs who are thinking, well, I don't have stories. You guys are talking about telling stories. Where the heck do I even get stories from? What people don't want to hear about what I had for lunch. What is the source of inspiration for these stories?
Oh, people don't want to know what I had for lunch. Well, you could make even lunch be a really interesting story. But where do you find inspiration for these stories? I'd say this is something that comes up quite a lot. I actually was teaching a storytelling class, a workshop last year, and one of the participants comes up to me about 3-4 weeks in and says, I don't think I've got a story to tell. I don't think I've led an interesting life. And I asked this person, so, have you ever traveled? Oh, sure. Yeah, I've traveled to 34 countries. And I'm like, wait, what? You interesting stories. But I think it's really a matter of, like, sort of reframing. For this person, just traveling to 34 countries felt just mundane, and felt like, well, nobody's interested in that. Well, if you take something and you think about, like, what might it be that was a challenge for me? So that's a very common story type. What is something that you found challenging, and how did you overcome that challenge? So one of my favorite prompts that I like to ask people is, think of an example in your life where you had to learn something new for the first time. It might be something as simple as having to learn to ride a bicycle, or something difficult like you had to change your career. You had to go back to school. a life circumstance caused you to have to learn a different way of doing things. That is a very common and relatable challenge. So, and for entrepreneurs especially, you're an entrepreneur. I'm a first-time entrepreneur. There's a lot of fear and uncertainty that I have about, like, the statistics are terrifying out there, Brian. 50% of new businesses fail within their first year. There's a 50% chance that I'm going to be listening to this podcast a year from now and be like, oh no, what a fool I was. So there's a fear that a lot of entrepreneurs have, and so fear is also a really good inspiration for stories. So share stories about what's your biggest fear in your business. Now, of course, the audience for that might be fellow entrepreneurs. You might not want to share that openly with customers, but depending on your business, it might make your customers relate to you better as well. So those are a couple of sources of inspiration. What have you found challenging, and how did you overcome that? What do you currently find challenging? What are some uncertainties or fears you're currently facing? And what are your hopes for overcoming those?
Yeah.
What about you, bro? What are some?
Yeah, I'm glad that that's where you went, because for me, even you answering that question, you immediately sparked a story in my head, because hearing you talk as a first-time entrepreneur, obviously I've been doing this since I was 19. It's pretty much all that I know. And so hearing you quote that statistic, which you're right, it's in the back of every new entrepreneur's head, 50% of businesses aren't even going to be here next year. And so where I go, like the friend of Hari talking now, is I'm just like, no, Hari, I've been there. Like in 2013, when my business partner and I were getting burned out, this is when we were running our marketing agency in Boston. One day I woke up and there was an email in my inbox, and he's like, hey, we have to close the company. Like, I can't do this anymore. I quit. We're working way too hard and we're burned out. And Hari, what strikes me about that is I'm responding to your take on this, your concerns, your worries. And I'm saying, Hari, that night, I literally spent the entire night Googling, where do I take the GMATs? How do I get into schools to get my MBA? What sort of career paths will an MBA open up for me? And the next morning I woke up and I realized, wait, no, just because this business, quote unquote, failed, it doesn't fail unless I decide for it to fail. I can pivot, I can transition. And that's my business failing story, is that I decided it doesn't fail. I'll always pivot. I will make it work. And so that's a real life story. You just brought me back with your answer. You brought me back to 2013, and hopefully hearing my story brings you to the realization of, well, no, it's not impossible for my business to fail if I don't quit. It might transition, it might change, but that's along the way. And so I love the fact that you threw the question back at me, because we're talking about inspiration for stories. And to me, it really comes down to observation. And I know this is something you so deeply share. You've got I'm going to plug it for listeners. You have an awesome Storytelling 101 audio series on your website that we're going to point listeners to at the end. But I know that you also say it's really about listening. You call it listening. I call it being a little bit observant here. I think about Seinfeld, for example. To me, Seinfeld is so freaking funny. Why is it funny? Not because of any jokes, punny jokes that they're telling. It's just because they observe life. I always think about anytime I'm at a coffee shop and I leave a tip, like a cash tip inside of a tip jar, and the barista turns around and doesn't see me leave the tip. I think about George Costanza, where he's like, did she even see that I left the tip? Did she see it? And he thinks about taking it out. Yeah. And so it's things like that. It's that observational humor, observational storytelling, really just thinking about the feels, Hari. And I know that the feels are so important to you. Talk to us about some of these things that now we're going deep into all of these different aspects of it, but how does observation, how does listening, how does sitting in your feels? I think that's an essential part of storytelling that we haven't talked about yet, is when you allow yourself to feel these things, you reflect on these feelings, you'll then be able to bring it back up in future stories.
Absolutely. No, it's really important. I really feel like storytelling is the most ancient art form, but it is also the most ancient persuasion and communication tool that we have. And so there is a lot of science behind storytelling. It just so happens to be there's a logic behind storytelling and story listening that we don't get formally trained in. We get formally trained in the logic of writing arguments, for example, right? But so that's like rational intelligence or logical intelligence or analytical intelligence. Storytelling relies on emotional intelligence, and so that idea of like sitting in the feels, that's actually letting the emotional part of our brain really do what it's so like literally wired to do, is to really be in the emotions and to make sense of the emotions. Storytelling is a meaning making and sense making tool. It's equipment for living, as rhetorician Kenneth Burke says. So for me, what happens with storytelling, with story listening, is it's really listening carefully for and observing for the other person being the main character in the story. So if I'm thinking about, like you just did, Brian, like for you, the main character in the story is somebody who wants to be an entrepreneur. So you, having gone through that journey yourself, you have a sense of like the various different feelings that somebody who wants to be an entrepreneur is experiencing. So somebody might call that empathy. I like to think of it as a story listening, because now you're kind of like walking in that journey as the main character and anticipating what might be some of those twists and turns that are coming up ahead for that person. And in those key twists and turns, thinking through, what's this main character going to be feeling? What is their overall motivation? In their lowest moments, what is the thing that they need to be reminded of? Like, hey, this is why you're doing this. This is your why. And in that moment, in many, many stories, there enters a really important character in a story. We've talked about the main character. We've talked about their motivating tension. But one of the things that I've been really motivated by is the role of the supporting character in a story. And if you think about some of the most compelling stories that we know about, there is always, in addition to the main character, there is always a rich cast of characters around them. But among that rich cast of characters, there's going to be a handful at the most, of supporting characters. And the role of a supporting character is really to be that person that comes alongside and reminds the main character, just like you did, Brian. You said, Hari, no, don't quit. Don't worry. You're going to be fine. Reframing the tension, reframing the challenge, and really inspiring the main character. Now, sometimes the supporting character can be an antagonist, by the way. Like sometimes the character is really compelling and helps make the story take an interesting plot twist. But I think for me, like being in the feels, it really means that you have an interest in this other person's story, and you want to feel what they're feeling for the purpose of figuring out, how can I be a supporting character in somebody else's story, right? Like you said, everybody goes through life thinking they're the main character. That's fine. We need to do that to survive. But for me, as somebody in business, for the purpose of helping social change, for me as an immigrant wanting to be at home, I need to also think of myself as a supporting character in somebody else's story. So which means when I encounter new people, I need to think a little bit about what's motivating them, what's the journey they're on, what's the challenge they're facing, how can I help them in their challenge? But Brian, I have a feeling that you've been a supporting character and had a listening ear. What do you listen for when you listen to other people's stories?
Yeah, for me, it really does come back. And I think it's so brilliant the way that you said, hey, you've said it multiple times actually already in this session today about how archaic all of this stuff, it is ingrained in our DNA by being human. And so for me, it really is those human things. There are so many things I can't relate to. For example, I just got an email in my inbox the other day from a podcast listener who said, hey, I'm starting a company. It has something to do with electric cars. And I drive an electric car, but gosh, I don't understand any of this stuff. And he's like, I'd love to hear what sort of things you could brainstorm when it comes to growing my business. And in my head, I was like, I can't tell you a single thing about electric cars, but what I can tell you about is all the things you're going to face when it comes to starting any business. So for me, it really is, I guess the simplest way I'll answer that question, Hari, is I look for the commonalities. I'm always looking for the commonalities. If you hang out with me for a day and walk around a city with me, you will see if someone's wearing anything Boston, I'm going to talk to them. If I see even a hint of a tennis brand, I'm going to talk to them. If I see a Manchester United logo. And so this is fun. I've actually never talked about this publicly, Hari. I've always mentally kind of called those attachments. And so the way that I picture it, I'm a very visual person. Hari, we're for sure going to talk about your visual storytelling style, because I know that's a big part of you as well. But for me, I picture it as like if I'm walking around with fishing hooks hanging off my body, like one of the fishing hooks is a tennis ball. One of the fishing hooks is holding a soccer ball. One is holding a Boston Celtics logo. All these different things that represent me, because I know that when I encounter anyone, we're tribal at the end of the day. You want to talk about storytelling being archaic and ancient? We're also tribal. That's also part of our DNA. And so if I can show people that I'm one of them and vice versa, we will instantly bond. For you and I, even before we hit record, we bonded over Massachusetts. It's as if you and I have been friends forever, that we've gotten coffee together for, the past decade. And so I always look for those attachments, anything to attach onto people, which I guess the bigger topic, Hari, I'd love to hear your thought on this, on the line of attachments, is the biggest thing I see, the biggest difference I see between great storytellers and below average storytellers is this. Below average storytellers won't give you those attachments. How often do we ask someone, hey, how was your day? And they're like, it was good, I went to work. And it's like, give me something, give me anything to attach onto. Tell me that you had broccoli cheddar soup from Panera at lunchtime, and we can start talking about that. It's really, we're all just looking for some excuse to launch into it. Talk to us about your perspectives on this, because I've never actually articulated this, and I know that you're so brilliant. You're going to make sense of a lot of these concepts, but where do these attachments, how do we weave them into stories? For me, a lot of it is geography and sports and travel, but what types of things can we do to give people launch points to say, yeah, that's me they're speaking to?
That's a brilliant question, Brian. That's a brilliant visual that you have right there of fishing hooks, and that's actually something I would say is for people to hold on to, is what are some things that you can share with other people that gives them enough hooks for them to see themselves or visualize something for them to hold on to. People on the podcast and on the audio can't see this, but in my background here, there's a lot of visual stuff that I have in my background. Each one of them is a little bit of a visual hook, right? But even in sharing stories about yourself, I'll share a couple of tips. One is things you can share that gives people a little bit of a hook for them to ask questions or become curious. And two is something that you can use to become curious about somebody else. Because for me, curiosity is what really drives a story. A lot of people think the idea of storytelling is to get people to pay attention. Attention is like a second order thing. People are I have ADHD. People, really struggle with attention. But what generates attention is curiosity. So if you can make somebody curious, they will automatically generate attention. So what can you do to get people to be curious about a story you're telling? The key here is to share a little bit that helps somebody visualize the scene. And so what does that mean? So let's say you want to share a story. You mentioned lunch, right? The most interesting thing, I just had lunch. I don't know how to make a story out of having lunch. All right. Now tell a story of going to have lunch, but add in enough detail for people to visualize that, right? So Brian, where did you have lunch yesterday?
Gosh, I'm trying to think. I think it was just at home. I think I've been slamming through work this week so far.
So what did you have for lunch?
I had a turkey sandwich with spinach and smoked Gouda, and it's so good. Smoked Gouda has become my thing since I moved to Florida.
Wow. Okay, so you could have just said it was just a turkey sandwich, but you added a little bit of detail. You said, okay, it's with spinach and smoked Gouda, and then you went in a little bit about smoked Gouda is so good, right? So now, for anybody else that's listening, you want to make your lunch sound interesting, right? Paint the picture a little bit, okay? All right. Oh yeah, yesterday I was so totally slammed. I was going straight out, but I came down to my kitchen for lunch. I opened the fridge door. I'm thinking, what am I going to eat? I only have 15 minutes. All right. I see right there, the block of smoked Gouda cheese that I had gotten at my favorite co-op store. That's one thing we have here in Florida. I take out the smoked Gouda and I begin to chop it up in slices, and I add some nice spinach to it, and there I have my turkey sandwich. Now, that little hook of smoked Gouda allows somebody else to now visualize that scene. And if they have an interest, I had no idea, Brian, that smoked Gouda was a thing in Florida, and now I'm curious. I want to know more about wait a second, how come smoked Gouda makes its way into Florida, right?
I can tell you exactly how. It's because, so everyone always told me that Publix is like the nicest grocery store. And obviously we don't have Publix anywhere else in the US. So when I moved to Florida, my first week of living in Florida, totally new state, totally new city. I didn't know anyone here. And so I was like, let me go to the world's friendliest grocery store. And I walked in, and I'll never forget, Hari. I never order things from the deli, but it just looked like everyone in the deli line was having fun. So I was like, let me get in line and get some cheese or something. And it was the nicest girl who worked behind the deli counter. And she's like, what are you looking for? And I was like, I don't know. What's your favorite cheese? And she told me this smoked Gouda is amazing. And there we are. 2.5 years later, I'm still talking about Publix's smoked Gouda.
Folks, this episode of the podcast is sponsored by Publix. If you want the best cheese and from the finest and nicest grocery store, go to Publix. Brian, don't you wish you and I could get some sponsorship money from Publix for that? So that's an example of like how you can add just a little bit of detail in a story to get people interested. The key there is to help them visualize. One of the things I like to share is that the of compelling storytelling and storytelling that doesn't really land or isn't memorable is respect the audience enough to give them a little bit of information, but then also expect the audience to do some work to build the scene. I think a lot of times people feel like they have to fill in all the detail for the audience, and that doesn't quite respect the audience's intelligence. You have to respect that the audience is intelligent enough to be curious, but then once they're curious, you have to expect them, make them responsible, make them do the work of building out the scene. What that does is once somebody else begins to build out like, good. They're now suddenly building a scene. They're now emotionally invested in that scene, and they're curious. They're now connected to the story. Now, here's a second tip now to flip that. If you're listening to somebody else and they're not quite giving you enough information, what are some things you can do to ask them that'll elicit stories from them? And it's to ask them to paint a picture. So when I'm on coaching calls with customers or that I'm coaching them in sales conversations on how to understand the customer story better, some things to ask about are, can you share a little bit about that time when you moved to a new area? What was that like for you? And so trying to put yourself into a scene and trying to visualize, gee, I wonder what was your first day. So where'd you go? What are grocery stores like in Florida, right? You're trying to picture that moment, and asking questions about that moment will begin to get people to elicit and share stories of their own. So that's another way that you can use curiosity to get those hooks, to ask somebody else to share a little hook without actually explicitly saying, tell me something interesting about yourself. I don't know about you, but that icebreaker question always like freezes me when somebody says, tell me something interesting about yourself. I'm like, I'm a storyteller. I've got a lot of interesting things, but if you ask me point blank, I'm going to freeze. I don't know what to share. That's going to be somebody else is going to find interesting about myself. But ask a little bit about ask them to tell you a little bit about their day slightly more visually, and then they'll tell you scenes.
Yeah, Hari, first of all, obviously, I think you're very brilliant in so many ways. I could listen to you talk about this stuff literally for days. The two things, though, that I really want to call out for listeners right now that you just revealed, I don't even know if you know that, like, these are just, you're so naturally brilliant that I'm just like, do you realize how good you are at these things? So the first of which is that intentionality. And it's I've got 2 words for this year. One of them is intention. And so you are very intentional in the way that you listen. And so obviously you're listening for listening's sake, which is incredibly important. But you as a storyteller, you're also listening to your own questions that you want to ask the storyteller. And as a result of that, you are bettering your future stories. Because if you start being more intentional about, these are things I wish this person was including in the story, now you know to include those things in your stories moving forward. So I love that natural insight from you right there. But again, it comes through reps. I'm going to put that huge disclaimer for all listeners here is that everything in life comes through reps. But then the second thing that I really want to call out, Hari, is also the intentionality of saying, That's a story. For example, I've never told the story about my first week in Florida ordering smoked Gouda at Publix. And so I know a lot of listeners, and to you and I, because again, reps, that seems to be one of the themes of the day, because you and I have so many reps that we can turn anything into a story, we do that. And a lot of people, especially when I go on other people's shows, and I always tell stories. That's why I love guests like you, Hari. You've got stories for days. People always ask me, what's your library? What is your repository of stories? Do you have like a list of stories that you go to? And I'm like, no, genuinely, I don't. Like, I just have that recall. I would argue that recall comes from intentionality of always, every Sunday, I do a coffee date with myself and I sit down with myself. I check in with the feelings that I'm experiencing, the experiences, the highs, the lows, the challenges, the wins, the things that I want to focus on next week. It is so much of this intentionality that gives me a story library without realizing it. Talk to us about your story library, Hari. How much of this resonates with the way you operate versus what other means do you have of adding stories to your library?
Oh, a lot of that totally resonates, Brian. I think it's with reps. It's with practice. I think the more that you collect stories, I think our brains are really I really do believe this. Our brains are wired to hold information in stories. So, I mean, a big part of how I got my start in storytelling is actually I'm passionate about teaching. And what I'm passionate about with teaching is actually creating experiences for students that are so compelling and so memorable that students actually listen, they pay attention, they're curious. And to do that, it meant really thinking about the student as the main character in the story, right? So then creating classroom experiences that are actually journeys and adventures. And in doing that is where I had this truism. A lot of people know this. Stories are actually the best way that we have to learn. Stories are the best way we have of remembering stuff. So for me, the idea of a story library that you said, Brian, that's really brilliant, Brian, because I really think that is actually how we hold information. We hold information as a library of stories. So first of all, just even realizing that is a big turning point for a lot of people. Once we know that that's how we remember stuff, it so reduces the pressure to have to memorize stuff, and to be like, oh my God, it's so overwhelming to think about all this information that I need to learn. No, make stories out of that information and you will just automatically just hold that a lot more. That recall will come naturally over time. So how do I build a story library? There's I think two ways, maybe three. I think the first way is because I'm a storytelling coach, and it's because I believe in the value of stories to bring people together. I spend a lot of time whenever I'm out in the world listening for stories all around me, and they are all around us. Like if you're at a coffee shop or if you're traveling, just listen to how people are talking around you. Yeah, it's eavesdropping. Yeah, it's overhearing, but you'll hear people share stories all around you. They're talking to somebody on the phone. They're talking to their loved one. They're talking to a friend. They're hanging out. They're going through life moments, and sometimes they're doing that in public. Just listening for people's stories around us, but also in interactions. You're talking to a server. You're talking to the person at the checkout counter at Publix. You're talking to the person at the airline counter. Simply asking them about their day, simply asking them about, how do they get into that line of work? A lot of people will ask me the question, "Where are you from?" And I it's okay, I'll answer. I'm from Massachusetts. It's fine. But I'm more interested in asking the question, where are you going? And so asking people that too, and getting interested in people's journeys. It's a way to build a story library, and listening to how people describe why they got into the field of work they're in, what do they find enjoyable, or what do they find frustrating about the field of work they're in, where are they going next, finding ways to get that information and then store that. This is something now. I have a story library of so and so, of my friend Nick, who started Prospect Coffee House up here in Bennington. I just did a storytelling event there. The more I get to know Nick, the more I get to know his stories about the challenges that he faced starting that coffee shop. So that's now in my story library. That's one way. A second way that I build a story library is I love watching particular TV shows that are really skilled at character-driven development. So my favorite TV show is Better Call Saul, Breaking Bad before that, a few other TV shows that are really about character-driven story development. And when watching TV shows, one of the reasons I like watching TV shows is because they're cinematic and there's an element of visual storytelling. I want to build a story library of scenes so that I can now begin to imagine and think about real people in those scenes and understand, like, what was the day like? Brian, that first day when you went to Publix, like, what was the weather like? Was it sunny? Was it rainy? So trying to build out environmental detail, sensory detail to help me feel what a story is like. And the third way that I build a story library is really through working with actual clients. As a storytelling coach, I want to understand the journey that a company is on. So when I work with companies, when I work with organizations, what's the mission of this organization? Why do they exist? What's their why? And oftentimes that's not written down anywhere. It's not on their website. It's not, and even the people themselves. So the story library that I'm building there is understanding groups of people as stories themselves. You mentioned tribal understanding, thinking about companies as tribes, thinking about mission-driven organizations as tribes, and understanding their story. So those are three ways I build a story library. How about you, Brian?
Yeah, I love that. Gosh, I think that a lot of what you said also applies to my way of building story libraries. But I think the one thing that I didn't hear from you, well, actually, I guess I did, because you talk about TV shows. For me, it's quotes, like the way that you'll lean on character development inside of TV shows. That's what I do for quotes. So for example, if I read an incredible quote, let's say it's from like Ralph Waldo Emerson or literally anybody, most people will just kind of add it on Pinterest and that's it. And that's the quote for them. That'll shape their memory of the quote. Hopefully they remember it. Whereas for me, and listeners know, for 7 years now on air, I'll drop a quote here and there wherever that it applies. And a big part of that for me is because I won't stop at the quote. Hari, what I'll do is I'll go deeper and I'll say, why and when in this person's life did they say that quote? It's reasons why, like Martin Luther King Jr., one of my favorite orators in history. That guy was incredible in so many ways. I use his quotes all the time. And every time I see a Martin Luther King Jr. quote, I say, oh my gosh, why did he say that? Like, what was he going through in that moment in time? And I realized, at times when he was a student, at times when he was facing oppression, at times where he was facing injustice, all these different times are when he came up with these things. And all of these, by the way, not so coincidentally, happen to be things that we all have experienced and gone through. And so for me, it really is taking it deeper. I'm just a big nerd when it comes to doing research and reading intentionally about different stories. So for me, it's going 20 levels deeper than just the quote, is understanding. I do the same thing with lyrics, for example. Hip hop is probably my favorite genre. People are always surprised. Every hip hop song, like if you actually read about the lyrics, there's so much beneath all of those. There's so many layers, but you'll only ever see them if you brought it up earlier, curious. If you're curious to do that research, that's where you'll grow that library. So I think curiosity is a big part of that library. Hari, gosh, I knew time would fly today. I can't let you go just yet because I know that for a lot of listeners, the one aspect that we didn't talk about in storytelling today is, why do we tell stories? What do we do with these stories, especially within the context of our businesses? Now, I think it's fascinating. You've worked with companies like Slack and Salesforce. You've seen stories on huge enterprise levels, as well as you're one of us on a small business level. What do we do with these stories, since we've talked so much about stories today?
It's a great question. What do we do with stories? Okay, so I am convinced that stories have immense power. Stories have the power to divide us. Stories have the power to put us against each other. But stories also have the power to bring us together. Like you said, Brian, like some of the ways that we are building stories help you and me connect. We've never met, but we suddenly feel this kinship right away. And that's the power that I'm really invested in helping us, all of us, use stories for. So what do I want to see people use stories for? Whether it's at enterprise scale or whether it's at the individual scale, it's to bring people together. So if you're a business like Slack or Salesforce, a lot of businesses make the mistake of making the stories be about their product. And you'll see this, if you listen to ads, the stories will be about, buy the product X3000. It has, 24 channels. It has, ultra high fidelity spatial audio, blah, blah, blah. And that's all about the product. So what do you do with stories if you're Slack, if you're Salesforce, if you're a large company, if you're an electric vehicle company like your friend that the podcast listener that called you up? Pivot it around. Take a sentence that begins with me, my product does this. Turn it around and make you, literally the word you, the beginning of the story. You can do XYZ with my product, with my company. And to do that means some humility. So what do you do with a story is be humble and understand what is it that the person listening really cares about, and build a story around what they care about. So I would say that's the number one thing that I want people to do with stories, is make the stories be relevant and interesting and valuable to the person that actually is listening, that you care about. Those are the stories that matter, and those are the stories that make a better world.
Yeah, and I'm going to add on to that point, Hari, because I think it's especially important for listeners to have these examples for their real life businesses. Go see how the greats do it. Apple is one of the best. Look at any Steve Jobs presentation and how much he talks about stories. I still remember his initial iPhone announcement. That was groundbreaking. And you're right, the iPhone had all these features. He didn't talk about them. He talked about, hey, remember that time you were in the middle of nowhere and you needed to send a text to your parents to tell them something? He talks about that in his product announcements. I'll never forget. So I had AirPods. I think we all kind of fell on the AirPods train pretty early because it was great to have Bluetooth headphones. And I'll never forget, I owned AirPods already, but then the AirPods Pros came out, and those were the ones that for the first time ever had that noise cancellation. And in my head as a consumer, I was like, yeah, they just want more money. They're going to release a new model every year. Why would I do that? But then I watched their marketing video for it, and it was a girl walking through New York City. And I've always lived in cities, Boston to Los Angeles to now Tampa, and I'm always walking through cities. I love walking. And so in their promotional video for AirPods Pros, it was a girl walking through, and she couldn't hear her music. She was like trying to dance, but she couldn't get into it. And then she used her fingers to turn on the noise cancellation mode, and boom, she could hear the music. And obviously in the commercial, you could hear the music, and she starts dancing, getting into it. And I was like, that's the thing about AirPods. I can't hear anything when I'm walking throughout the city. So it's that storytelling, visual storytelling as well, that really got me. So Hari, I love your insights there. Gosh, like I said, I'm pretty sure we could go on about this for days. I always tell people I have the coolest job, Hari, but I'm starting to think that you have the coolest job. So next time I'm in Massachusetts, we got to do something storytelling together.
We absolutely do. We both have the coolest jobs, man. You get to listen to so many story library of so many entrepreneurs. So I love listening to your podcast and learning from the stories of others.
Heck yeah. No, thank you so much. Honestly, I so deeply appreciate that. As we are coming towards the end of this interview, though, I want to plug you. I want listeners to not be the end of the Hari road for them. And by the way, listeners, spoiler alert for all of you, Hari doesn't know this yet, but I will be inviting him back for an Action Saturday. So keep your eyes peeled for an Action Saturday segment from Hari. But Hari, I want to open the stage for you. Tell listeners about all the awesome stuff that you're putting out there. Pimp Your Storytelling 101 audio series. I want them to know about that, and then drop some links on us.
Oh, thank you, Brian. Well, I'm new to this. I'm just starting out. So any advice people have on what I should be doing, I welcome them. Please go to my website, storycoach.io. Storycoach.io. For a couple of reasons, storycoach.com is already taken by somebody else, either the storytelling coach. But storycoach.io is the one way to remember that is we're in a world of digital storytelling, and I'm really focused on recovering the human and the animal storytelling. So the IO there is a deliberate kind of twist there. It's not a fancy app. It's for analog, old school, human to human storytelling. Storycoach.io. Now, some of the things that I offer are classes and workshops. I primarily do those in person, but I will be looking at and doing, traveling workshops and online workshops. Also coaching and consulting. But on storycoach.io, you'll also find links to my Instagram page. It's at Hari Tell a Story. And I'll be posting short form video there and sharing short insights on storytelling techniques. So for example, one quick technique is the difference between a customer testimonial and a customer story. If you're looking for a testimonial from your customers to put on your website, entrepreneurs, you can of course do that, put a quote. But better still, turn a testimonial into a story around that customer and out that customer had. And that is something I offer help with as well as to how do you craft a customer story. So if you're looking for help with your business and being able to take some of your customer stories and making them more compelling on your website, reach out to me at storycoach.io, but also follow me along on Instagram for storytelling insights and tips.
Yes, Hari, you say you're new at this, but that was so brilliantly summarized by you. The important thing is, listeners, through all of that, you heard Hari talk about how this benefits you, your businesses, having the ability to tell client success stories rather than just boring testimonials that end up on your website that nobody ever reads. So I also want to add, it's one of the things that caught our eye when we first came across Hari's work. Go to his website, storycoach.io. Obviously, we're linking to it down below, but when you go to storycoach.io, under resources, you'll see Storytelling 101. All of you love audio. I know this because you listen to our podcast, and I'm so thankful for that. But Hari has a 5-part audio series on Storytelling 101. You don't have to opt in for it. It's literally right there on his website. It's embedded there. You just click play. And if you thought that Hari was brilliant here today, trust me, there's so many layers of his brilliance that you're going to want to take advantage of. And Hari also puts his email address on his website. So if you want to reach out to him, thank him for today's episode, or get in touch and start having him in your corner. This is a guy you want in your corner. He's going to make your marketing better. He's going to make your conversions, your relationship with your clients, your customers so much better. So definitely check out storycoach.io. I promise you that I am not an employee of Hari, but I can't stop talking about all the amazing things that he's up to. So Hari, honestly, this was so much fun. I'm excited for you to come back on an Action Saturday episode, but from the bottom of my heart, thank you so much for joining us here today on the Wantrepreneur to Entrepreneur podcast.
Brian, thank you so much. It means a lot to me. And all fellow entrepreneurs out there, good luck with your journey. And please consider me a supporting character on your journey.
Heck yes. Thank you.